of my neighbor using my snowblower to clear the walk around. So we have this, I live on a corner, and what happens is, so I have the only snowblower on the block, and so I usually just keep going. I just go down the block and come back, which gets me goodies, you know. Somebody actually threw money at me out of the car window. So I have a second job, but if I need it. But my neighbor took over the snowblower, and he said it was so slushy that it was almost impossible to move. But anyway, so thank you very much. And first of all, I want to commend Senator Chase for Senate Bill 6544, which created this task force. Lou asked me on the way over if I know of any states that have tackled this in the same way as you are. And I think New Jersey is now putting together a task force on this. There are a couple other states that have been sort of dabbling on the edge. Colorado's been talking about this for a couple of years, but not with the same sort of energy and sort of concerted effort that this state has done. And to my knowledge, it's the only state where there's been actual legislation on the books for this. So as I see it, you're way ahead of the curve when it comes to that. Next. So the way we think about this, we started out, my institute started out talking about the many futures of work. And I'll get into that in a second as to why we made it plural. We had a national conference a little bit over a year ago where we pulled together both policy level folks as well as practitioners to come together and talk about what's going on in the changing structures of work. And what was really interesting about this conference was that we were able to pull together 200 people from around the country and a few from other places in the globe. And then we made them work. So we divided the conference into 6 working groups. And each working group worked for 8 hours on a particular set of issues, like on-demand economy, structural racism, issues of that nature. And what came out of it was a rather remarkable set of conversations and findings. We asked them to put ideas forward in terms of what to do about this. That report's available through our website. And I have one copy here which I can leave too. It then prompted us to think, okay, what's our next act on this? And what we came to the conclusion, and when I say we, I have a board of directors, 18 people on my board, was that we wanted to move it from a conversation about describing what is to talking about what needs to happen. And so we've shifted our conversation towards achieving the promise of work. So how do we make it move forward? How do we sort of take the issues that people are experiencing today and then help them either act on it locally or more collectively? And collectively, it could be states, it could be national, it could be international. So we're going to cover 4 major areas. I'm going to try to do this in 30 minutes. First of all, get a little bit more into why we talk about many futures of work. Our sort of proposed framework and how to think about this in terms of framework for prosperity. And then we've sort of distilled, and this came from the conference directly, into sort of 6 major policy areas, which are not to be treated independently. They are to be treated as interlocking, but they can each take on their own focus as well. So it can be a matter of concentration, but you need to think of this in the context of the other 5. And then I had a few observations because I had a chance to read the document that Lou and Joe put together and the rest of the staff about sort of, what are some of the policy questions. And I just had a couple of observations about that. Next. So one of the issues that we've constantly keep fighting on this is that there's a sense of inevitability about what's going on and the changes in the structure of work. And partly it's driven by the conversation about, well, technology is doing X. And that sort of gives a sense that there's something inevitable about what's happening. When in fact, technology is a tool, a set of tools that people apply in policy decisions or other sorts of decisions. And so it's the human factor in terms of how you're using technology and for what purposes that really are changing work structures. So to our sense is that none of these things are predestined. These are all driven by individual decisions, corporate decisions, policy decisions, government decisions, and so forth. And technology enables lots of things to happen, but to simply say, well, it's just technology, sort of dismisses the fact that there's a human component to it and it's controllable. Next. Also, and I borrowed this picture from another presentation from another person, which I just liked anyway. And that is that it's not a matter of, people all don't, the reason why we use specifically the futures is that people don't start in the same place. They're different things, they're gender, race, age, disability, where you live, all these factors are important in terms of your starting point. And to simply talk about equal opportunity isn't sufficient because, as the picture on the left shows, you can all be equal because you're all standing on the same box level, but they're not, but in fact, they're not equitable in terms of what the opportunities are. And so it really does make a difference to talk about things, to disaggregate it and to take it into, and to say it's not just a single future of work, but that it really means different things for different people. And we have to be constantly cognizant of that as we're thinking about policies and practices and how they influence what goes on and whether they create real equitable opportunities for folks instead of just equal. Next. So we have sort of a 4-point framework for prosperity, and I have to acknowledge one of my board members, I should, Bill Lazonic, who is with the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, who really has done a significant amount of writing around and research on the issue of corporate shareholder value strategies and financialization and so forth, which is now grabbing attention, but Bill's been at this for 15, 20 years. So it's not anything new for him. He's been pushing this issue for a long time. But in one of his papers, in fact, the paper he wrote for us, for our conference, he came up with this sort of definition of what prosperity looks like, and I think, and we've essentially adopted it. And it's got 4 major elements to it. Sustainable economies, that's characterized by strong and a vibrant private sector, and stable and equitable growth. Second, productivity growth that makes it possible for higher standards of living. Third, stable employment opportunities that enable people to remain productive through their working lives and provide them with enough savings for decent retirements. And finally, equitable sharing of income. And this isn't socialism here, folks. This is a matter of essentially being compensated for the added productivity gains that that you've enabled the business or whoever you work for to also enjoy. And so having that reflected in compensation is important. Next. So in looking at it from a policy standpoint, we've boiled it down to some major principles. The first one, and we borrowed this from another speaker of our conference, a guy named Peter Georgescu, who is an acknowledged plutocrat. He self-describes himself this way. You wouldn't know it when you talk to him, really. He's a former head of Young and Rubicon. He's a chair emeritus. But he has been on a tirade the last several years on addressing the issue of how capitalism is being destroyed by shareholder value. And has been really one of the prominent speakers on this thing. So talking about a guy who talks against type, he's very much that way. But in his presentation that he gave us last year, he talked about really the key stakeholders in business. And he documents this by going back and looking at the value statements of businesses in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and going into a little bit into the 90s. And these value statements had all of these elements, these 5 elements, that there are 5 key stakeholders in business: the customers, employees, the communities in which those businesses are located, the shareholders, and then the enterprise itself. I mean, you do things for purposes of advancing the enterprise independent of the other 4 categories. And this is really, to me, this is a sort of a touchstone in terms of thinking about how do you have a sort of a balanced approach when you're looking at employment, changes in the structure of work, and how you try to balance it. And you need to think about this in terms of balancing it with all 5 of these stakeholders, not just one over the other. So the primacy of this sort of shareholder primacy that has driven a lot of corporate decision making in many locations, and you see this evidence of this is in stock buybacks, it's in executive compensation formulas that have really distorted have created huge gaps between what the senior management earns versus the rest of the workforce, who are not really gaining in the advancements in productivity. That's taken the one over the 5 has really produced some serious distortions in terms of compensation, income, as well as wealth creation. Go ahead next. So how do you deal with this? And the interesting point, and Blazonic does this a lot in his research, but you see this in some of the other work too, is actually the promotion of innovative enterprises, but innovation in a different sort that we typically talk about. Innovation we think about as a sort of the smart young person who's come up with this bright idea that really sort of tinkers around the edges, and it's become a sort of a way of coming into a market with a quick idea, and we celebrate that as an innovation, and it is. But it isn't something that is organic or sustainable over long periods of time. An innovative enterprise is the one that carries an idea forward from creation all the way through final production, and does so in an iterative fashion, that does so almost internally. And so it's a process where it's a sustained investment, it's a sustained reinvestment on the part of the business, and one that is organically grown. Now, this is going to sound old-fashioned, but this is actually very much in line with some of the old economy models, where you see, where Bell Labs was the idea generator for AT&T, but they had the internal structure to be able to take those ideas and move them into final production. Now, it was a dinosaur in other respects, but in terms of being able to sort of continuously reinvest and reestablish itself in terms of market, in terms of ideas, it was, and there are other companies like that as well. Motorola is one that I think of often as a Chicago enterprise that's lost its way, because it's lost the capacity to be able to take those ideas, and you see Motorola essentially as a broken up company, and move them forward. Now, a modern example is SpaceX. SpaceX has gone to insourcing a lot of its production, partly because the only way that they learn is from their own mistakes, and the way they learn from their own mistakes is because they're actually making the stuff. Okay, and that was their logic of going to insourcing. So it's actually an old economy model and a very advanced business in terms of what it's trying to accomplish. Now, you can talk about other labor relation issues and so forth with anything that Elon Musk touches, but in terms of the design of that model, that design is in fact very human-centric in terms of being able to understand mistakes and learn from them and then improve on it. Next. So let me just finish up on that last point. So looking at ways in which you support businesses that do that, and you can, so it isn't just a function of, and this is where I disagree with a lot of governments, is that they're sort of like, well, you do business the way you want to do it, and we'll provide you the incentives to be able to carry on. You can make choices about that in terms of how you support the growth of those businesses and ask questions. And it doesn't have to be government incentives. It could be other sorts of things in terms of employer relationships, where you ask the questions. What is it that the business is trying to accomplish? And the businesses that are really focused on the five stakeholders, and the ones that are truly trying to innovate, and it doesn't have to be a big fancy business to do that, that's one that is more sustainable and has more positive outcomes for all 5 stakeholders. Second, assuring the standing of workers, principle number 2, in determining the course of equitable policies and practices that enable them to succeed in advancing their well-being during periods of economic disruptions and uncertainties. Mouthful of words, but why don't you go to the next slide. So here's the backdrop. The phenomena that we've been seeing most recently, and we've been talking about in terms of technology advancement, has been phenomena that have been occurring over a very long period of time. This dates back, in my memory, to the late 70s, where you've seen sort of a practice, and this is where Lozanic and I disagree. Bill sees this as really a function of shareholder value. I see this as something that has been taught in management schools for a very long period of time. There's been, I have a master's in business from Kellogg at Northwestern. I mean, that's what I heard, when I was going through school on this, and I did this as a not so young adult. But there are various sets of activities or sets of decisions that sort of keep this, have shown that there's been sort of a common factor over a period of time. Pensions, went from defined benefit to defined contribution. Shifts the risks from business to the worker. Production, going from very vertically integrated to elongated supply chains, which fractures the workforce and it makes the process every one of those elements along the supply chain a lot more vulnerable. We saw this really with the automotive crash that occurred in the mid-2000s, 2000, 2010. Operations going from insourcing to outsourcing, again, shifting risk, externalizing the process. R&D, going from in-house R&D to you buy it, and then you marketize it. You monetize it, you maximize the value from that standpoint, but you don't really own it because you haven't made it in the first place. HR development, going from the employer being responsible for HR development to one that has shifted a lot of that burden either onto workers or onto the public system. The public system, frankly, that was never prepared to take this on as a primary role, and one in which the expectations are that, what's wrong with you guys because you haven't done a good job? Well, it wasn't designed that way in the first place. And treating workers as expenses rather than as assets. So what's the cost of these workers for these things, as opposed to what's the value of the knowledge that the workers have that can help improve operations and productivity within the firm. Next. You can stop me anytime if you have any quick questions or want to throw anything at me.
Careful what you ask for.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm used to it. Yeah, I spent 12 years working for the Illinois General Assembly, and I've done redistricting, so I've had people throw things at me. So.
I did a question, Phil.
Yeah, sure.
Real quick question. When you say promote businesses, what do you mean by promote?
So, a simple example. I sat on the Chicago Workforce Board for a number of years. And one of the things that just drove me crazy was the sense that, okay, employers coming in, they say they want to do they want X number of dollars to help support training within the business. And so to my question back was, well, okay, so what are they going to do to assure that that there is a career path internal to the business. What's their investment in this? And that was, we weren't supposed to ask that question. And the one that really drove me crazy was on the nursing shortage in Chicago. And we were going, hospitals were coming, and you have to understand, I have a bunch of doctors in my family, okay? So I grew up with hospitals and so forth. And so they were saying there's a shortage. And I was saying, well, okay, show me the shortage. Well, we have all these vacancies. Okay, why do you have these vacancies? Well, we have a lot of nurses quitting.
Quit? Yeah, we're doing it.
And so I said, okay, so what happened? Have any of you shut down wards or stopped surgeries because you don't have enough nurses? No. Why? Well, we get contract nurses. Well, there's no shortage. I mean, there's a supply out there. It's just not a supply that you're willing to pay for. And so, or you're willing to change your work practices, which is actually really the bigger issue, to deal with this. Because, they're not focusing on the 5 stakeholder piece. And so, my position, and I got outvoted on this a lot, was, okay, what's the bargain? What's the deal? Now, Colorado was interesting because Colorado was actually started taking this on. And they were saying, okay, fine, what are you doing to retain your nurses? Okay. In addition to, yes, do we need new nurses? Yes, we need to expand the flow of nurses coming into the system because they're going to be higher demand. But to ask the workforce system to essentially replace senior experienced nurses with junior people was something that I think we should have pushed back on. Okay, so to me, it's more of better partnerships as opposed to, and asking questions and being critical in terms of the discussion, not saying we don't want to help because there was a need for this. Does that answer your question?
I love the explanation, but give me an example of how you would promote a business that adheres to the 5 principles. How would you promote them?
So,
Do you want to repeat the question?
yeah, okay, sure. How do you promote a business that adheres to this? You don't promote them. Maybe it's a bad choice of words on my part. I think what you do is you have smart partnerships, between all the different elements. And so this isn't a government thing. It's with the unions. It's with a variety of other actors that are in this, and not just government. Now, it's easier to deal with a privately held business because, in my estimation, more often than not, they really do have a community. I mean, they live in the community where they operate their business, or they may have several plants, but they still have these sort of family community ties. So it's a bit easier where you have the, sort of this, once they're public and now they're dealing with shareholders, it's a much different set of issues. And it's a harder set of issues to deal with. Then it really comes down to management in terms of where their head's at. And you have companies like Costco, again, not perfect, but at least they talk the talk and they walk the walk a bit, And so and I'm not just going to single them out, but I mean, there's an example where you do have businesses that can operate in the public sphere that do this. Now, culturally, I would say that, my experience in dealing with several of the German companies, German transplants, is that they have that sort of culturally built in. I met with a group of people who were in from Germany on Industry 4.0, and it was they all spoke English, but it was like talking 2 different languages because, they have a very different mindset in terms of sort of how they approach this. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of it's built on the apprenticeship program, but they do have problems with the incumbent retraining, which I didn't expect to hear from them. Yeah.
As long as you're open to interruptions, so let's see if we can maybe blow this meeting apart. But like last week, I went to a Future of Work group like this in Portland.
Yeah.
And I think they were basically starting with Bill's question. How do you, and I think your answer, that how do you establish this
Just water.
this commitment to, that there is this presumption that there is a quid pro quo. The businesses have externalized their HR, their human resource or employment issue to workers in the community. Here comes public policy, what's the quid pro quo here? They spent the entire morning talking about social contract. Right? Okay, you can, give me the eye roll.
No. I mean, not directed at you, but I mean, I was just.
Okay.
I mean, we hear these conversations going on.
Exactly. That is where the Germans don't need to have the lecture on social contract. That's part of their culture. We should take that question of social contract to the Kellogg Business School and all the other business schools. That's really. But if for each future of work program in each state, if that's the expectation that they set in their statement of principles, then at least that's part of the public discussion. If there's data at the end to say, did this recommendation meet our goals about social contract, that's an opportunity to reinforce that. In fact, what you could do, and I haven't really suggested this, but in my mind, if you really want to enforce the social contract and answer Bill's question, you would say, at the end of each year, we're going to evaluate each one of these recommendations. Every project that met its expectations, there will be some kind of positive incentive, I don't know, and including social contract, to represent social contract. In each activity that failed, there will be a recapture or a clawback, right? Yeah. And now there will be a public ceremony each week where the newspaper is all full of, well, here's Costco and here's Volkswagen and here's IKEA meeting their social obligations, and here are Motorola or whoever else we want to name focusing on their shareholders. So that would, again, be an opportunity to have a public discussion about what was our public purpose here. We've accepted the fact that you've externalized all these costs to us. Where's the quid pro quo? I think that's a way to change the...
Yeah, so the reason for the eye roll on social contract and a bit about, and the other one
I'm famous for eye rolls. I can...
No, I'm fine. Eleni and I have this immediate affinity for each other because of our last names. So it's sort of a Greek thing too. But there are a few, we've gotten enamored, in my mind, I think part of the challenge that we have in getting this discussion moved forward is to get past the buzzwords. The other one is high road employer versus low road employer, and my apologies on that for those of you who bought into that, because, and I mean no disrespect, but if you're trying to tell an employer to change their ways by starting out by calling them a low road employer, doesn't really help. And so, we create these sort of value-laden statements, which is one of the reasons why the framework is, the proposed framework that we've been sort of using is what it is. Because we don't use social contract, we don't use, they're designed, our principles, our framework is designed to be sort of forward-looking, aspirational, and not necessarily one that says, okay, let's demonize those who fall outside of this. And because I don't think you're going to get cultural change, and this is what it really requires, by demonizing folks. And so, my emphasis has always been sort of focusing on sort of what do we want to get to, and then encourage that process. So, for instance, business press that talks about, what's the shareholder return? If the business press changes that conversation and say, what's the value return to the community and to the others, it's one that gets celebrated. It's not that the other one gets put down. Yep.
Just in thinking about Bill's question, we currently have an environment and policies right now that operate against what you're proposing. We have, I'm thinking about Amazon's search for a new location.
Chicago lost.
Yes. But but everything was not about, it wasn't about those, taking into account the 5 stakeholders. It was all about shareholder, it was all about increasing profits. And I mean, it's a, we don't tend to set our policies around rewarding business for investing in their employees and reinvesting in research and development and insourcing rather than outsourcing. Our current policies do the opposite of that. They reward the opposite of doing that. So I think it's worth really thinking about, so what does it mean to promote innovative enterprises? What does it mean to really invest in your workforce? And how do you promote that? Because right now we are not.
Yeah, I mean,
And it's not because we have an absence of policies. We have policies that actually favor the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you listen to Lozanic or you read Lozanic's work, and I'm not here to shill for Bill, but if you look at his work and you see a lot of this is driven by SEC rules and regulations, and tax policy, what was rewarded. People were encouraged to take shares in the company as opposed to direct compensation. But that distorts the decision making in terms of the shareholder, because then you have senior management really invested in propping up or in some cases spiking the value of the stock, because it improves their own compensation.
And tax policy, that it wasn't just by circumstance that defined benefit plans have tax policy has also figured in. So I think, it's not an easy, I don't think. So what's the answer? That's not
there's no simple, there is no, you're going to get, at the end of this, there's no simple answer, but anyway, let me just quickly run through. So some of the challenges faced by workers, I'm not going to go individually one by one through this, other than, globalization, obviously, fracturing of workplaces, and we see this in terms of supply chains as well as in terms of franchises. Structural barriers, such as with race and gender and the like. There is no, in fact, there's becoming really a less, we still have a sort of we can still think of jobs in a traditional sense, but that's becoming less so. Now that doesn't mean we're eliminating that there won't be jobs in what we consider to be the traditional form. But what we consider to be the traditional form is actually pretty much an artifact of industrialization, and it was something very different prior to that. So the question is, what's it going to, is something that we really don't have a good sense of. How workers are valued, and then 2 other major challenges, which we'll touch on a little bit later, that increasingly workers are really responsible for their own education and training. This is something that used to be part of the business itself, and it was something that, and we talked about this in terms of incumbent, but also apprenticeship. And when businesses took on the job of training, they trained people for jobs that existed within the company. Okay, they were moving people from point A to point B because they knew there was going to be a point B, and the business was responsible for that. Well, when you externalize that, that means that the outside has to be able to figure out what's going on the inside, and it's really tough to do. And then finally, information asymmetries. Our information systems, LMI systems, aren't very good at supporting what workers need to know in order to prepare themselves for what's coming. Next. And then consequences, increased commodification. So it becomes more of, my bucket of skills versus your bucket of skills. And by the way, Eleni, I did find a study that talked about, that's the first one I saw about the value of credentials in electronic markets, which I'll give you a site. So credentialing is important, as this study cites. But it also has, it has some consequences to it too, because it opens the market in terms of who the competition is as well. Okay? But it does provide a good market signal. So you have to be, in dealing with questions of credentials and commodification, it's really a matter of degree as opposed to what's good or what's bad. Self-directed and self-financed learning, which we talked about, labor market inadequacies. And let me just give you a quick point on that. So a few years ago, and it's still something I'm interested in doing, I started asking the question, is there a source of information, is there LMI out there, system, that can help people figure out that when they're done with training, there will be jobs in that occupation? Because when you look at the data that we collect today and the projections we collect data on what is, so sort of like what's going on in the marketplace, which is always 6 months to a year late, okay, in terms of lag time. We have projections in terms of what the demand is, okay, what the demand will be for workers in a certain field. We have nothing that marries that to what's the supply going to do. So if there's a market signal out there saying that we need 1,000 new nurses in this labor market, we have no idea how supply is responding to that. And so for the person who's going into this, or for the training institution that's doing this, training, excuse me, we can't tell that worker that at the end of their year or two of training, what's the likelihood there's going to be a vacancy available for them to fill. There is no source of information on that.
You've hit my hot button, and I just apologize that, again, I'm maybe disrupting this, but my coworker's on an advisory committee for the Secretary of Labor, and they're on Workforce Information Advisory Committee, and this was their #1 recommendation. The labor market economists in each state they've expressed this as their holy grail, the quest for 2 decades to get this kind of information. And the suggestion that they've given is to get the unemployment insurance records that employers file each quarter, to add a field for each employee on occupation. And the labor market economists say they can connect those to educational identifiers and do longitudinal studies to say graduates of this program at the University of Idaho, if you can share the data, find jobs in their field of study at this percentage rate. And Senator Wyden and Senator Rubio had a bill to add this to the comprehensive immigration reform a couple of years ago, and Senator Cantwell tried to put it in the customs enforcement bill for the Trade Promotion Authority. It's something that her piece actually passed in the Senate, but got washed out in the conference committee. So that is the sweet spot for being able to do any of that closed loop comparison. And it would also give you regional data and national data if your market is regional or national, and if you graduated from a school in California and got a job in your field of study in Illinois, you could incorporate that. And this is something that, again, is a public policy question to say this is important. We have these values, these policy values, and other stakeholder interests, and we need this information. I would also say you keep talking about the past generations ago. When employers were managing their own internal labor market, they had this data. This was the management data they had to say these are the career trajectories that we need. These are the succession planning that we have to do and the skills that we need to do. They have this labor market data now that internally, now that we've externalized that, we need that same data.
Yeah, I actually, thank you for that. We actually came at it a little bit of a different way. And then if anybody here is a farmer, they would understand, they seem to understand this quicker. So we took the approach of looking at this and how you do futures in grain markets. And, which is actually, it's called a predictive market. And some people call it wagering, but there's ways to do it without wagering. And so what we were thinking about, but there we had a data problem, was to actually create predictive markets around occupations, so that essentially it's people would bet on what they projected to be the vacancies in nurses in Chicago in December of 2019. The problem was, how do you settle the bets? Because unfortunately, the data on what actually the vacancy rate would be in 2019 wouldn't come until sometime in mid to late 2020. Because the surveys of the market wouldn't catch up. Because this is done through labor surveys. Now, there's one state in particular, Minnesota, actually surveys employers twice a year on what's vacancy rates, or what are the vacancies in occupations within their areas. And we were hoping to attach it to that, but we never could pull everything together. But so we kind of came at it a little bit of a different way. But every time I would describe this, I would get a big eye roll from everybody else except farmers, because farmers understand grain markets. So anyway, and then finally, we'll come back to this too. Defining work in a way that sort of preserves an arc of a career. Like I said, I'll get back to this in a bit. So I just want to use it as a placeholder, but we'll come back next. So, how do we achieve this for workers? Fair share in the value of productivity gains. There are other ways in which you're seeing this through ESOPs, direct worker investments, where workers actually have the opportunity to actually grow their wealth in addition to their income within the firm. So cooperatives, ESOPs, and things of that nature. Joint worker-employer initiatives. It's an old concept, but it works. And unions, frankly, play a very large role in this. Or other forms of collective action. And then community action. So communities need to get engaged. And we've seen this in places where communities are actually engaged and often in rural areas, frankly, where it becomes a matter of the community as a whole acting in concert with respect to a single employer. Next. Government has a role. This is a nonpartisan statement. Government plays a major role. It sets the rules in terms of the equitable distribution. It doesn't require it sets the basis for it. It sets the rules for it. What's the playing field? And there needs to be consistency over time, so that the rules don't change to favor one group or another depending on the swing and who's in office. That there needs to be some sort of longer-term view that sort of transcends day-to-day politics. And I know that's hard to imagine in today's sort of hyper-partisan method, that anything gets labeled as government is bad or government is good. But the fact of the matter is that government's been setting the rules all along. We talked about this in terms of the the rules with respect to how you value shareholders and how you compensate employers. There are consequences to that, and those rules need to be thought of in those terms, in terms of what are the consequences to the stakeholders. And it has a duty to properly regulate commerce, for for the benefit of both people and community. So how do you do this? And I apologize for the size of the type on this. I kept cutting words out and it wasn't making any difference. So, and I want to get on one slide. So this kind of, the work that you're doing here, I mean, frankly, the task force, the public discourse on human and machine competition, which is part of the discussion of this task force, is essential. Having that kind of discussion is critical. Germany has done this, and I don't cite, I mean, there are cultural differences between Germany and the United States. So I am not citing them as something to emulate. I'm simply suggesting that there are ways in which governments can play a role in having this conversation. And so they have undertaken Industry 4.0, but they have a parallel initiative called Work 4.0, which doesn't get talked about very often. And it is one that directly addresses these issues of the human-machine competition. And it's not competition in their minds. Their question is, how do we employ technology in a way to augment what people do, not replace what people do? Government safety nets are increasingly out of sync with the realities of the 21st century. I keep hearing talk about portable benefits. Portable UI, possible. We see this actually in construction industry because they work it in terms of hours as opposed to jobs per se. But so there can be parallels on that. But in the areas of such as minimum wage, where work is task-based as opposed to hour-based, it's very difficult to apply the same sort of minimum wage standard in those circumstances. You can in some. It's like, you know, they've talked about this with respect to Uber and other sorts of sort of routine tasks that happen over the course of the day. But in terms of pure task-based work, you know, it's what you bid.
Quick question about that. Is there anything, sorry, over here.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So when you say it's hard to apply the minimum wage to like a task-based employment, I mean, I think about it often in terms of people that are paid piece rate as being kind of a similar, you know, analogy.
Yeah.
And we do it here. I mean, farm workers are,
Okay.
you know, have the right to minimum wage in the state, and you know, people that hang, you know, sheetrock and do insulation, you know, often done on a piece rate basis, and they still have the protection of minimum wage
Right.
if they're. So why is it harder?
Well, let's say if you're if you're doing software and you're paid for a task to develop a particular product. I mean, consultants do this all the time, where you know you're asked to sort of bid on a project basis or an hourly rate. Okay, and hourly rate you can sort of factor in what your needs are. On a project basis, it's hit or miss, and there's no guarantee on that. And if work is being offered only in the form of what's the end result, and you accomplish this in a certain period of time, then it's really up to the person to price it right. And that's not necessarily something that gets captured. That doesn't get captured through minimum wage.
If you think about it in terms of a contractor who has the ability to set their own price, I see that. If you think about it in terms, which is often described, you know, in this context, somebody that's working through an app or, you know, working in kind of a non-traditional compensation structure, it seems like that's actually very trackable, and that you could, and then that it's much more similar to you know, agricultural harvesting than it is to, you know, selling a product basically that you're customizing as a contractor.
Yeah.
Microsoft is sitting next to me.
That's Jack.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Whatever. Random business person. Sign a label too. So I mean, I guess in my mind, I kind of bifurcate those two examples, right? Where there's like a product that's being sold versus a service that's being rendered. I just don't know if that's telling.
No,
There's any learnings from that.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure. I mean, it isn't necessarily a first choice issue either. So, you know, can you devise methods to be able to get at that sort of thing? Yes, but it's not a direct here's minimum wage, just apply minimum wage to, it's other sorts of ways of thinking it through that, it's not a direct parallel is my point. Workers' compensation, in my mind, is one that is still the Achilles heel on this. In terms of portable benefits, there has an Achilles heel on this because there is no employer of record per se. And so workers' comp is, the history, I know the history is, it was a devil's bargain, that occurred at the early part of the 20th century where employers, where workers gave up the right to sue for cause because of the fault of the employer in return for receiving quick action on disability and medical care. And so it's the original no-fault insurance. And how you devise a system that works in the sort of the gig economy is, with workers' comp, to me, is you really need to come up with a different way to do it. To simply say we're going to extend workers' comp to gig workers, for instance, is one that I think is one that doesn't translate directly. You need to have another environment to this. Now, the way it works in other places is if you have national health insurance or some other thing, then the health insurance piece is at least covered, then you're dealing with the disability issue. We don't have that. So it presents different sets of challenges.
Some of it, just a little on that, some of that is how we define the employer-employee relationship, because a lot of times in the gig economy there actually is an employer who is setting the rules and setting.
There's misclassification issues, but let's say, I'm speaking of the ones that are truly classified correctly. I mean, there's the misclassification problem, which needs which is getting a lot of attention, needs to be given more attention. That's one thing. But those who are truly appropriately not employees under our current definition of, and there are, by the way, different definitions of what that is, depending on what kind of law you're looking at, then that group that falls outside of it is one that's not protected by the typical set of safety nets that we have in place. Rapid growth of digital platforms. One of the big challenges with the digital platforms, and I got to watch time here because we said an hour for this altogether. One of the big challenges for digital platforms is piercing the veil of the algorithm and understanding what's going on under the hood. And it's not necessarily one that's deliberately designed to disadvantage one group or another. It is a situation where even the people who draw up the algorithm don't understand the biases that are internal to the algorithm itself. But more importantly, there are other examples of digital platforms where we celebrate them as sort of these open marketplaces where in fact they're not open at all. Told somebody today that if I'm going to, on my trip back to the airport, I'm going to take a cab. I don't use Uber. One of the reasons I don't use Uber is because of the design of the way that platform works. So we think of Uber as a transportation company. In fact, it's an information company, and it's trading on information that's selling both to the provider of the service as well as to the customer. And the only entity that knows both sides of the market is Uber. So their business is really information, and they control the flow of information, and they set the prices, and they set the conditions for the operation. And that's a different kind of model than what gets celebrated as part of sharing economy, where in fact the transaction is being done through a platform, but the platform is actually the device, not the price setter. And so that changes, and that becomes what somebody's described as digital sharecropping. Okay, it's the owner of the information that is really setting the prices for the market itself. And there is and it's a role that government needs to increasingly think about in terms of how that gets played out, because to the extent that the biases are inadvertent, that's fine. There's ways to begin to audit that and to correct that process and do that in a non-confrontational way, saying, look, this isn't working and this is why. But there are also ways in which the market gets distorted and has a has a set of biases in there that aren't for the public good, and there's potentially a role for government in that as well. Then there's the other set of problems is around the limit the capacity of workers to actually compete. We see this with non-disclosure, non-compete agreements significantly. We've actually seen this in franchises, where there's some evidence where all the franchisees will essentially agree not to pilfer from each other, which essentially locks the labor into those particular franchises. And there was an action that was just taken, I forget where it was, where that was actually conceded and there was an agreement not to do it anymore.
That was here.
Was it here? Okay, thank you. And then I misspelled the word monopsony, monopsonies. I added a G that doesn't exist. So for those of took the quick definition, it's a monopoly, but on the buyer side. Okay, so in this case, it is a single company, and you see this a lot in rural areas, where you have the employer, and that employer is setting wages for the entire area, and essentially sets the conditions for employment. But it also begins to exist with this franchise agreement and other, where these franchisers, whereas essentially in this case it was a group of buyers, employers buying labor, who are essentially setting the conditions for labor. And there's some debate as to whether these things can exist over long periods of time, particularly if work is being offered through electronic mediated platforms, because you have a way of getting outside of that. But there's in local markets you can see that as taking effect. Rules and regulations on that have not caught up, like antitrust law has with respect to sellers, companies that sell products and services. It hasn't caught up on the labor side. And that is something, again, that states can do something about. Question is to what extent that has occurred within the state to drive that policy making, and it's not a particularly well understood area. And then finally, it costs money to support this, and to squeeze government out of actually its appropriate role in this has long-term consequences for workers. Number 4. I gotta start running through the rest of this. Okay. We've talked a lot about this already. Using technology to expand opportunities and possibilities. I mentioned this in terms of sort of augmentation versus replacement. Again, it's not quite that simple of a choice. There's going to be both. But why don't you go to the next point? So, when you think about automation, Fry and Osborne have sort of laid out their sort of what's most resistant to automation, and it's the kinds of jobs that are limited perception and manipulation, those that require creativity, and those that require some sort of social intelligence. Okay, next. So OECD has done some phenomenal work. They just published a new volume in September on the future of work, which I highly recommend, and I can send Melanie the link on that. In fact, I'll send you the report because it costs you to buy the report, but I have the report, so I'll send it to you and you can distribute it. They actually did something really interesting. They started breaking it down into tasks, and then they used the data that they've accumulated with their PAC survey which looks at skills and tasks internationally. And so, okay, what are the things that are most likely to, looking at this Osborne and Fry concept, the ones that are most susceptible, the tasks that are most susceptible to automation. And their number is that the jobs that have about a 70% risk of automation, in other words, about 70% of the tasks are sort of risk automation, that's about 10% of the workforce. And those jobs are going to go away to automation. Then there's another 50 to 70% number in terms of the tasks, and that represents about 27% of the jobs. And those are the ones that are going to be significantly changed. And so these are where you're going to have, where you really have to focus on in terms of retraining, reskilling people, being able to move to different, acquire different skills in order to remain employed. But these jobs aren't necessarily going away, they're just going to change significantly. Go to the next one. McKinsey did some analysis, basically the same sorts of conclusions. They say about 60% of occupations have sort of they're 30% technically automatable, okay? So they're fairly consistent between the two reports. But the point is it's not the 40% of the jobs are going to disappear that sort of got everybody going a few years ago. McKinsey, OECD, and others now are coming in and saying, well, you really need to disassemble these jobs into what people are doing, and then that's going to give you an idea in terms of what's really at risk. And then factors affecting the pace and extent of adoption. Is it technologically feasible? What's the cost of developing these solutions? Labor market dynamics, what are the economic benefits, regulatory and social acceptance. And the two factors that I keep citing too is what's the take-up rate by business? Okay, I do a lot of work, one of my board members is with the Machinists Union, and I was meeting with the local lodge in the Chicago area, and the biggest demand they have is for people who are trained on the traditional lathing, turning machines, drilling, and so forth, because these employers are successful, they're small businesses, and why do they need to change their equipment if they're producing and they have good customers, and they're producing stuff at a profit? And what they really need are workers who can operate the old machines, and they can't find anybody, and it doesn't make any sense to them to sort of upgrade, because they don't get they don't get a marginal kick for it. And so it's a bit counterintuitive, but and these aren't businesses that are sort of the backwater. These they're doing precision work. They just for them to invest in that capital doesn't make sense, and they're not seeing what the productivity advantage is going to be in terms of payoff on the capital equipment. So that makes things, and then also changing business models. Again, it's going to whether the business itself wants to buy into sort of this maximization of profit, or they have other sorts of goals in terms of those 5 stakeholders. Next one. So the OECD came back and said, look, we can begin to look at this in terms of regional shocks, and this is where rural-urban makes a big difference, but also just in terms of just looking at local labor markets per se. Businesses have a way of concentrating, and the way they concentrate and the way they apply technology is going to have a disproportionate effect depending on where you are. So businesses that are looking to, that they have jobs that are more prone to being automated, tend to be locally concentrated, and that could have a disproportionate effect on the entire labor market. And then there's, on the other hand, what used to be the case, which was that people would move because the jobs weren't there anymore, has been a phenomenon that has we've seen. We've seen the movement of people from rural to urban, but from urban to urban, from one place to another, or even from rural to urban, has slowed because, you know, they either lack the skills to where those new jobs are being created, or they get locked to where they live. And, you know, when the housing market went upside down, a lot of equity went with it, and in the process, people got locked into where they live. Next. I'm sorry I'm going really fast here, folks, but I'm trying to. So I'm going to leave this just as a sort of a placeholder, and I suggest that this is something you may want to think about. So there are consequences in terms of economic development policy, and when you marry it up to the sort of what's at risk. And OECD has come up with this model that simply suggests what you need to focus on in terms of your economic development policy are essentially in the job creations in predominantly less risky occupations. And again, they could, you know, the sort of the methodology that they've developed can help you think through about what those jobs look like and what industries that they occur in. And, you know, where you really are in trouble is when you start losing jobs or businesses that are fundamentally also businesses that should be strong because they actually have less risky occupations in them. And so to begin to sort of, from an economic development perspective, looking at your communities and saying, which communities, what's sort of the dominant nature of the work within the communities, and do they have jobs in those communities that are either high risk or low risk, and what's the direction in terms of growth? And how do you begin to affect that in terms of your policies and practices? Why don't you go on? Fourth one is, how do you thrive in periods of great disruption? And this and the next couple slides has basically one major theme to it, and that is that in order to succeed, for workers to succeed during periods of great economic upheaval, and it looks like we're going to be seeing this as sort of a chronic condition as opposed to temporary periods of time or short periods of time, is the ability to be able to remain flexible, which requires two sets of activities. One, a good grounding in broad knowledge. And some people would talk about this in terms of liberal arts education. And when I talk about it, I don't think about this in terms of college education. I'm thinking of this in terms of K-12 education. So understanding, going beyond STEM, and understanding things both in terms of culture, sociology, history, and the like, and having an appreciation for it. That actually, and there's some evidence on this, that actually shows that people are able to be more adaptable to change. Okay, that is critical to that. And then obviously the second thing is the ability to be able to acquire the specific skills that you need in order to be able to do your work. And you got to think more in terms of work than jobs. Okay, work can be in any number of forms. It may not even be in a formal job. Thanks. So this is both at the front end in terms of how people come into the workforce, but then also, and I hate the term, I have to come up with something different called, I've been playing with re-apprenticeships. So sometimes people have to go back to more basics and relearn learn a new set of tasks and skills to do a different kind of job than they did before. But also income of worker training, which is much more iterative and cumulative over time. Next. This is the one set of principles for which there's no easy answers. None of them are easy. This is the most difficult because this is so culturally embedded. And that is that in talking through and thinking about achieving the promise of work, you have to deal directly with what are the structural differences that exist. It isn't enough to simply say that they exist. It has to be part of the core policies in our estimation. So structural racism, gender bias, sexual identity, discrimination on the basis of identity, barriers related to age, ethnicity, and it's not just unfair treatment of immigrants, it's of ethnic groups as well. Prejudices against veterans, sort of the damaged hero syndrome that I keep hearing from veterans groups is something that grates and creates disincentives for employers to hire. Every veteran coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan has PTSD, and it's going to somehow be destructive in the workplace. And people don't want to take on those individuals. Impediments to people who have been previously incarcerated, and we can go on. This is not identity politics. This is a matter of the reality that there is lack of equity in the system that we built, and we have to recognize that. And that these are all social and cultural conventions. There's nothing biological in this. And so, and to recognize that means that they also can be changed. But culture is very difficult to change. And it's not one that you can legislate. Next. So, the one thing that came out of the conference, which I was impressed by when we talked about this, was that the onus is on the people who are in the advantage to take on the leadership to deal with these issues. It isn't enough to simply respond to people who are disadvantaged, but in fact, it's important for those who are in fact advantaged to take on these issues directly and to speak to this and to speak truth to power on these issues. It's done by narratives of inclusivity. It's by collective actions taken by all stakeholders. But that the path forward is one where it's incumbent on those who actually have the advantage to be the ones that help nurture the discussion. Next one. And this is a very long quote. Dee Davis is on my board. He's head of the Center for Rural Strategies out of Kentucky. And he spoke at our conference last year, and he's a storyteller, and he gets up and he just sort of starts to weave these stories. But he started talking about rural people. And he said, folks in rural areas always talk about themselves in terms of what they used to do. I was a trucker, I was a lumberjack, I used to do this, I was a coal miner, whatever. And it just struck me that, well, it's not isolated to rural communities. People talk about themselves in those terms all the time. But what really struck me was that and again, part of the workforce system, and I'm very much a product of this in terms of my work, is we think about people sort of changing jobs and changing careers like you change clothes. And dismiss the value of that person's identity. So I have a very good friend of mine, Byron Zeideman, name that some of you might know. Byron ended his career in government as acting assistant secretary for ETA at the Department of Labor. Byron grew up as a farmer. Okay? He today identifies himself as a farmer. Mm-hmm. Okay? That's what he thinks of himself. And everything he has done in his career, he puts in the context of the things he learned to do as a farmer. Okay? It doesn't deny all the other accomplishments. It's simply saying he thinks of himself in those terms, okay? And our system is such that what we ask people to do is to dismiss what they did and to not build on it or not to appreciate it or to say, well, gee, these are the lessons you learned in truck driving as a trucker. How do you apply them forward? What is the arc of your career? And that's the way I try to think about these as what's the arc of a career? How do you respect who that person is by the way that that individual identifies himself or herself in terms of the work that they've done? And so in thinking forward is in terms of achieving the promise of work is making those dots connected. So Lenny was telling me earlier today in terms of for credentialing was how do you stack credentials or how do you build credentials on top of credentials? Okay, it's that and more. Because to me it's more of how do you continue to respect the identity of the individual in the process. And so people need to be flexible, they need to be adaptable, they need to be continuous learners. They're not going to get support for this by and large. And so the way to help accomplish that is to continue to build on that and to help individuals recognize that what they're proposing to do or what you're proposing that they should think about doing is in fact connected to what they've done. And at least in terms of the values, maybe not the specific tasks that they did, but in terms of the learning and experience that they accomplished. Next. And I touched on this. Next. So just the final set of observations. You talked about apprenticeships in the policy problem statements. One of the things to think about, we need to go beyond apprenticeships and think about pre-apprenticeships. And that got drilled home. We're doing a project now in Chicago. We will be doing a project in Chicago where we're actually going to look at 2 pre-apprenticeship programs in the construction industry and do some case studies on this and then actually try to do the wage analysis looking forward from both all the way from pre-apprenticeship all the way through apprenticeship into journey level work. But so you need to extend it beyond just simply the sort of the registered piece of this thing. It really has to do with it. And pre-apprenticeships presents all sorts of problems because there's usually very little funding for it. There's very little support for the individual because you have oftentimes, and maybe you do better here, but oftentimes there's very little money for childcare and transportation and other sorts of things and no wage that really necessarily goes along with the pre-apprenticeship. So that's a real challenge. But to me, the success of the apprenticeship programs are going to be in the success of the recruitment, and especially if you're trying to move into expand the extent to which people you're recruiting from non-traditional areas. So in the case of the construction program, the 2 pre-apprenticeship programs we're going to look at, one has been doing heavy recruiting in African American and other communities, minority communities in Chicago, and the other one is Chicago Women in Trades. And looking specifically at how those 2 pre-apprenticeship programs have done their job because they are really trying to move people who aren't traditionally in construction. In Chicago, it's primarily whites, and the largest minority group is actually Latino. Those are the 2 dominant groups in construction in the Chicago metro area, and very low participation rates in terms of African Americans relative to the size of population. And so that's been a problem that people are beginning to try to solve, or they have been trying to solve. On self-employment, there was a comment on problem statement on that. One area to think about is that people aren't naturally inclined to know how to run their own business. There's a whole lot of training that goes along with it, or hit and miss proposition. And so if you're truly going to invest in terms of self-employment support, you really need to think about what is it that people can can learn, and is there a role that community colleges and others can play in terms of providing that sort of training support. It isn't, you know, it's like being a parent. You have a kid, nobody gives you a training manual on this thing. And usually with the second kid, it's easier than the first. I mean, the first kid, everything is in place. The second kid, is eating dirt? Well, it's not going to kill him. So there, that process is not something that's easy to learn, and should particularly support. Eleni touched on this in several conversations we had, and this gets into sort of the economic development side of things. We've been really interested in the issue of what's going on in the supply chains. And one of the trends that we're seeing is that because of this demand of pulling cost out of the entire structure, that in fact you're hollowing out the engineering capacity of these small suppliers because they can't afford to keep it. They're building to blueprint. And so the challenge here is, how do you sort of make your small employers more flexible? And part of that is access to engineering, and part of the things we've been thinking about is how do you develop partnerships, particularly with area universities, on doing that as a bridge. And then finally, incumbent worker training. I was involved in creating an incumbent worker training program in Illinois back in the 80s. And then we studied them in 4 states, Illinois, California, Missouri, and New York. And to my knowledge, it's really still one of the better studies out there on incumbent worker training. And the eureka moment for us was to figure out that incumbent worker training is not really about the incumbent worker. It's really about the success of the business. And that the programs that really work for both the workers, because they were retained in their income, they were able to continue to work, and income went up in many cases. And for the business was when the business defined the problem in terms of business outcomes. So in the example, so for instance, they had a quality issue. So what's the problem you're trying to solve with quality? Well, you have, problems with, rework costs, returns from purchasers and so forth. How do you solve it? Well, we're going to do statistical process control, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, total quality management. How are you going to do it? Well, we need to train the workers to do X. How do you measure success? Do you do better on your quality measures? And when employers thought of it in those terms, they invested. Okay, that's where the investment went. And so when people are trying to measure incumbent worker training programs on the basis of wages and earnings of workers, it sort of misses the point. Because the point really is, what's the business problem you're trying to solve? And if you add to that, I'm not saying don't think about what the workers are doing. I'm saying what you need to think about, in fact, is that the real value, the real purpose of the incumbent worker training program is to improve performance of the business. And you need to link that to your incumbent worker training initiatives. So those are just some observations. I went over, I'm sorry. But
That's okay, let's get Peter McCann. We got to get an extra half hour to make sure. So,
Okay.
so we've got a little bit of time. Eleni,